episode of Cultivate. Thank you for watching. Thank you for joining us for today's conversation. This topic that we're going to talk about today, a lot of you have reached out. A lot of you want to talk about this. And I have invited two amazing women to join me today. Today I have Tessi and Jackie joining me. So Tessi is actually a mental health therapist, and Jackie is someone that has walked through some difficult times in her life. Today we're going to be talking about grief, and so we're going to be discussing this. The reason why I've asked both of them to be here is because I wanted to share about grief from the perspective of someone who has experienced it firsthand, and then also hear from a mental health professional who's going to be able to give us some feedback and some points as to grief, what it looks like, and maybe even talk about some of the things that people or society has made us think that grief should look like or has to look like. So thank you so much, guys, for joining me today on the podcast. Love having you here today with us.
Thank you for having us here. I am honored, truly, for the invitation, the opportunity to share my story today. And my story goes back to October 29th, 2021. My son, Justin, who was 17 at the time, he was out for a morning jog, and when he was struck by a car, he was running along the sidewalk on 152nd Street right outside the walls of our neighborhood, and he was struck by a car. The female that struck him did not stop. She did not call rescue. She continued to drive home, and she parked her car in her backyard. She tarped it. She covered her car with a tarp, and she hid. And she knew what she had done was wrong. Those around her knew what she had done was wrong, and I had no idea that this had happened. It was a Friday morning, and there was no school that day. It was a teacher planning day. And my son, who was 10 at the time, and my daughter, who was 6 at the time, we slept in. There was no school. They knocked on my door, came into my room, and were like, "Mom, Justin's not in his room." And I was confused. I was like, "What do you mean he's not in his room?" I rushed downstairs. He was not in his room. I started to call him. He wouldn't answer his phone. I checked the Ring doorbell camera, didn't see any activity. I was confused. I was texting him, "Where are you?" You know, he's 17. I'm thinking maybe he's with his girlfriend. I was calling his girlfriend. She wasn't answering. And in that moment, I remember getting a frantic. I don't know what's going on. I get a notification on my phone from Nextdoor app. Yeah. And it said, the banner said, does anyone know, there's a lot of traffic on 152, does anybody know what's going on? And so I think to myself, that's right outside my four walls. And so I open up the app and I start reading the comments, and I see someone write "tragic hit and run," and my heart sank. And I just thought, I don't want to believe that this is my son, but I said, I something in me just said, let me just grab the kids, get in the car, and drive as close to the scene as I can. And when I got there, I explained to the officer, I said, I don't know where my son is. I just saw that something happened here. And so he told me to hold on, walked away, came back with 2 detectives, and I explained to them. They asked me for my son's a picture, his name, and they told me, you know what, it's very busy here. Why don't you go home? You're with the little kids, and we want to help you. We can't give you an answer right now, but we want to help you. And so Of course, I drove back to my house, and I remember calling a friend. I told her what was happening. She was praying with me, and I just kept thinking, God, please don't let this, this can't, please don't let this be me. I just pray that this is not, this has nothing to do with us.
Yeah.
And so it was almost as if I got home, and it was almost as if they had like driven right behind me, because as soon as I walked into my house, there was a knock at my door, and I opened the door, and it was the same two detectives, and they asked if they could come inside. And so I let them come inside, and they immediately asked me if I could send the kids upstairs. And so I sent the kids upstairs, and then they asked me, is there someone that you can call? Can someone come and be with you? And I immediately, my heart sank.
Yeah.
I knew exactly what they were about to share with me. And I said, and right there, I went into shock. I can honestly tell you there's not a lot that I remember from that point forward. They wanted me to, I couldn't think. They were like, please, they asked me to call someone, and I could think of no one. And I said, I don't know who to call. I just started saying random things like, I don't have family here. Like I couldn't even think.
Yeah.
And so, of course, I finally call a friend, and I tell her, the cops are here. They're telling me that they need someone to come be with me. And so,
At this point, you knew, but they hadn't told you.
They hadn't told me, but I knew. And of course, I was in shock, and it just took at that point, it just feels like time stops. Mm-hmm. Time stopped. And I remember I started to hyperventilate. I couldn't breathe. I walked outside to the backyard to get air. And so they felt like they couldn't wait any longer for someone to come. And that's when they shared with me that they did identify that it was my son. And I remember asking them, like, how do you know it's him? Like, how can you confirm? And they said, because when we called the number that you gave us, the phone that was with him rang. And so in that moment, you're just like, you can't believe it. I just couldn't believe that was happening to me. I couldn't believe that that's what they were sharing with me. Your mind goes absolutely blank. And all of these emotions just started to flood. Just shock, anger. You just want to scream, and you just can't think. You just can't think. You're just like frozen. You're just stuck in a fog. And I just remember they did share with me that it was a hit and run, and that because they were finally able to identify who it was, that's why they hadn't moved. They weren't able to identify him because he was running and he didn't have any identification on him. And so once everybody started to get there, my family and friends started to come and stayed with me, and they were able to leave to find who did this. And I will share that I am so grateful that God hand selected the detectives that he placed on this case, because they worked effortlessly. They did not sleep until they found, and it was hours later that they did find who had done this. And I always say my heart hurts for those who go through something like I went through and will never know. Yeah. Because in these type of cases, many times they go unsolved. Yeah. And That's also another
part of it.
part
Jackie,
of it.
walk me through. I think when we suffer loss, I think sometimes there's a moment where you're surrounded by people and everyone seems to not understand your pain, because that's something that you, unless you've lived it, you can't really, understand. But then people move on with their lives. People have to continue with their jobs, and it's not that they forget about you, but the reality of life sets in. The reality of now there's this gaping hole in your life, in your heart, in your home. And so there's the moment of shock, of disbelief, of what is this? Is this happening to me? How is this happening to me? There's the moment where you experience that deep pain and that loss. But then there's life after that, and how life goes on. And so what are some of the feelings and the emotions and the ups and downs that you had to face after that?
Grief is so, I always share, grief is so complex. There's so many emotions. There's anger, there's the feeling of loneliness, the feelings of, the all of the waves. And I always say, grief comes without warning. When it comes, you don't even know when it's going to come. It just hits you like a truck. You could be at a drive-through at McDonald's and you're about to place an order, and all of a sudden it just comes. It comes in waves. And one of the things that I experienced early on was that I knew that I had to allow myself to process all those emotions. I had to allow myself to let the emotion come, let it pass. But I knew not to let it stay. I felt like I knew that if I need to cry, I'm going to cry no matter where I am. And if I need to be angry, I'm going to be angry, but I'm going to process the emotion. I'm not going to let it stay. Mm-hmm. And, I was very, very blessed and grateful because I always call them God's army of angels that he sent me on this earth. And immediately after the accident, I was surrounded by such an amazing community of friends, family, church, everyone. People just showed up. Mm-hmm. It wasn't, my house was full for such a long time. And they took care of everything. When I tell you everything was taken care of, when you're going through something like that, you can't even make decisions. Yeah. There are things that I couldn't make any decisions. I couldn't think. I couldn't process. I always tell people the way that I felt personally for a long time. I felt like I was at a carnival. At a carnival there's a carousel, right? And I would imagine this carousel, and this carousel is just going round and round and round, and I'm just standing there and I'm looking at the carousel. And every now and then the carousel stops, right? And this carousel is life. And I'm standing outside of life because of what has happened to me. And every now and then the carousel will stop, and I'll be asked, "Are you ready to get on?" And I would look, and my answer would be, "No, I'm not ready." And that's the best way I can describe it, is that life does keep going, right? But in my world had been impacted in such a way. The unimaginable had happened. My son lost his life. There's nothing that can prepare you for that. And I just, it is something that you just have to take it one day at a time. For me, like I said, I had a lot of support, community, friends, family, church members that were there constantly, phone calls, visits. I was not left alone for a while. And I was actually very blessed that my niece at that time volunteer to move in with me, just to be able to be there with
Keep you
me
company,
and the
yeah.
kids so that I wouldn't be alone. But life, what happens when you do take, this happened in October. And so I did have to go through the holidays. And that was extremely difficult. And I feel like for me, once the holidays went through, I took that time to take a break. But once the holidays had passed, it was like, it's a new year. The phone calls become less, the text messages. And so you're left still feeling this loss, this pain. What do you do? And for me, I found that it was really, it's only by God's grace, honestly, that I'm able to share my story today. And I always say that grace is a daily dose of supernatural power to overcome. And so I feel like I leaned into the grief. And that's the best advice that I can give anyone is lean into the grief, allow yourself to process those emotions. And if you lean in and there's so many resources out there. I know for me, staying connected to church was a huge
Part of it.
You know. The accident happened on a Friday, and that same Sunday, for instance, my family is running around the house and we should go to church, and I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, how is it, like, they have no idea what I feel. Like, I understood where they were coming from, but in my mind, I was like, I couldn't make decisions. I was just like stuck.
Yeah.
I couldn't think. And I was actually angry. I was like, they're all here, like, we should go to church, and they're running around the house getting everything ready. And there was something that I'm just thinking, and something inside of me says, get up and go to church. And in that moment, I looked at my family and I'm like, we should go to church. And so then they were like, oh my God, she said we should go to church. Let's get up. And so we all got ready. And I'll never forget that day, Pastor Alex was preaching on condemnation versus conviction. And it was exactly the message that I needed to hear. I remember walking through and there were people that knew that the accident had happened, and I was greeted and everyone was just so welcoming and supportive. And I listened to his message and I remember thinking, this is exactly what I needed to hear today. Because it allowed me, when that happened, I felt so much guilt, so much pain. I remember thinking, my God, he was only 17 years old. Why did you allow this to happen? I was so angry in so many ways. You know, what if I would have woken up? What if I would have seen him?
Yeah.
What could I have done to have stopped this? And then I remember that message made me change my perspective. And I started to realize there's nothing that I could have done to have changed what happened.
Yeah. And I want to explore more of that feeling, but I want to ask Tessi, when it comes to a mental health, perspective, the faces of grief, they can look so different on different people because of different circumstances. What would you say might be some of those lies or misconceptions about grief that people might have that you've seen?
So you have a love-hate relationship with things that people publish, like, for example, like the 5 stages of grief, right? There is such a thing as the 5 stages of grief. However, it's really not linear. There are studies, and when you actually talk to people, you find that even just like in the phases of recovery, when you have like an addict that's recovering, you can go back to anger. You can go back to denial. You can then go forward and maybe you're getting closer to acceptance, and then you have a trigger moment where it's a holiday or birthday or something, and then you go back into that. And so the healing isn't really linear. And I think the outsiders really want to see sometimes, right? Their intentions are good. Yeah. They want to see their loved ones or the people like progress. And when they kind of see like, oh, wait, this is not good. Like she's kind of sinking back into this. I don't know. I see her kind of depressed. I thought we were past this. But again, because it's not linear. So I think that's a huge misconception. Grief and the healing process of grief is always going to be different. And I would argue to say that you kind of always continue to grieve sort of forever in a sense.
That's what I was going to ask.
Yes.
When it comes to loss, do you ever really get over it? Because I don't think so. I think you would learn to just live with it.
So the way that I like tackle this, so like I have a client and they're grieving. So my first priority is like, okay, how do I relieve the day-to-day distress? Because, hey, she still needs to parent 2 other kids. She can't lose her job, right? And, there's just so many other factors that other people don't even take into consideration. Like Jackie has 2 other kids, right? It's like healing has to happen eventually because, hey, I have more to live for, right? And so it's like, okay, how do you first get that person to be to a level of stability where they can manage the day-to-day distress that comes with the grief? And then it's like, okay, it's client-led. So maybe they're not ready to rush into, okay, we need to talk about, a mood, like how are we going to stabilize your mood? Like you're getting really depressed, or if they're not ready and maybe they're going back to anger, or maybe they're just still in denial, you have to kind of sit there and you have to sit with them and you have to say, okay, how are we feeling today? What are those thoughts? What are those feelings? What are those emotions? And I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions. It's not linear. It goes back and forth, but you really want, first and foremost, to help that person become somewhat stable to the best of their ability so they can function.
Could you be years removed from that moment and still
Absolutely
be brought back to maybe it's been 10 years, 15 years, and you haven't felt anger for 10 years, but it hits you?
So the distress is important because, for example, Jackie is telling her story. She's becoming emotionally activated, but she's not distressed to the point that she can't have a conversation with you. She's not distressed to the point that she's falling apart and it's like, stop the camera.
Yeah.
Everybody come in, and that is a perfect picture of healing and progress. But at the same time, there's still grief there. Right. You've just become better at, hey, this is not going to distress me. This isn't impairing my ability to function. It's like you feel it. And again, so I've experienced grief, not the same way you have, but the way I would maybe put it into words is it's like, it's going to sting. It's always going to sting a little, but it's not like a stabbing pain. Okay. It's not like a gut wrenching.
Constant.
Right.
Yes.
It's like you always feel a sting. There'll be a memory, there'll be a photo, there'll be a birthday, and you have to sit with that emotion. But again, it's not distressing to the point where you can't function. But I believe that it still kind of always just lingers.
Yeah.
You just get better at coping and managing it.
Jackie, you were talking about then now going into a moment where maybe you now were processing and having questions. Maybe, why my child? Why our family? Why did God let this or allow this to happen? What were some of those questions you had, and how did you navigate those questions?
So, though that comes from, I think that comes from the initial shock of just processing. Why did this happen to me? All of those things. And I remember just coming to reminding myself, I will tell you, part of my personal, one of the things that I personally went through, and I had that moment where I was able to kind of come out of my shock for a moment, or where I had an encounter, I'd rather say, is it was I think it was actually the going back to that day that I went to church, and we came home actually from church, and my house was flooded with people. I was feeling a little overwhelmed, and I remember I said, I'm going to go take a shower, and I remember going into the shower, and I was just inundated in grief, and I remember crying, just in so much pain. And I remember thinking, like, how am I going to survive this? I think that was my biggest question, like, how am I going to survive this? And like Alex, I grew up in church my whole life, and it was church. Not going to church was not an option in my household, and but I can, even growing up in church, I can say I have only heard God's voice a handful of times personally. And I remember being in the shower, and I was crying out, thinking, my God, how am I going to survive this? Like, and I remember crying out to him, like, why didn't you save him? Like, you could have saved him. Like, why didn't you save him? And I remember that audible voice that you just know, it just, God met me, and I remember hearing him say, I did save him. And I did save him. I was there, and he's with me now. And I just dropped to my knees. I remember crying. I was again in the shower, and I remember hearing him whisper that he didn't die in vain, that many would come to know him, through this loss. And I just remember in that moment, God reminded me, he reminded me, of John 3:16, and how he says that God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that who would ever believe in him would not perish but have everlasting life. And I remember thinking, my son knew the Lord. He came to accept him at a very young age. And in that moment, I was like, he's with Jesus. He's with Jesus. And it was there that then God gave me a vision of his celebration of life that we would have, and how many would come to know him. And I just remember thinking, my peace comes in knowing that he's with God, and how lucky I was to have him, and how lucky heaven is to have him, and the promise that God gives us that I will see him again,
If I can just interject a little bit, I'm hearing your story, and it's funny because, I have a lot of secular clients. So I've been able to see the side of it where somebody's trying to work through grief and they don't know God. And then hearing you work through the grief and your journey, and you do know God. And it's funny because, therapy is amazing, obviously. I'm not knocking on it. It's what I do for a living. Okay. So we have to kind of keep people coming to therapy. But I always, have these conversations with my husband sometimes. I pray for my clients sometimes. And I told him the other day, there's so many things that therapy is good for, but there's just some things that only God can do.
Yeah.
So therapy can do many things. I believe in that. I believe in the fusion of the two is amazing, but there's some things that only God can do.
Yeah.
That therapy could never accomplish.
I was going to ask you that. As Christians, there's a way that we can come to a point where we can reconcile the both.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean that there's not that pain, that grief, that question, because we're human. Right. And while we may not have that question answered per se, there is this hope. We say it all the time. We mourn, but we mourn differently because there's a truth that we know. But I wonder, how does someone who does not have this hope cope with these questions? How do they move forward?
It's hard. I mean, I can teach them all the coping skills in the world. I can teach them about emotional regulation. I can teach them how to relieve some emotional distress. I can talk to them about things that they can do to, like, the brain hacks, which we'll get into a little later. But ultimately, you hear someone talk about grief, and you just hear that there's brokenness. and it's a brokenness in the soul, this brokenness in the spirit, and no amount of therapy can really get a person to become whole again after such a loss. And it's like, I'm hearing you, and then I'm like, wow, this is just such like the perfect blend of having God in my life. And then I hear you talk about all the different tools that I'm sure you learned in the process about sitting with the emotion and just not allowing it to stay, and things that I would say to someone, but at the same time, just holding on to God, holding on to that. It's that peace that surpasses all understanding.
Yes,
How am I finding
agree.
peace right now? How am I even able to step into a moment of gratitude and thank God? Okay, I'm thankful that he knew God. I'm thankful that he's with Jesus. What? You just lost your son.
Yeah, as I hear Jackie talk about that, like what a beautiful revelation to have, to look at this situation that has the potential of destroying someone's life if you allow it to, and seeing how God can bring something out of. You're that perfect example we talk about all the time, that God can bring something good out of something terrible. Like you have lived it. And as you were mentioning that and the things you're grateful for, I started to think about the people who might have experienced loss and they are on the other side of this with regrets. I know people personally that now they experience loss, but I'm left with did I do enough? I wasn't speaking to this person. I was angry because of this. From your perspective, from your knowledge, what would you say or do in that case?
So that's actually one of the stages of grief, right? It happens in the bargaining stage, right, that they call it. And it's that person's going through, again, just it's part of the process. What could I have done better? What can I do? I mean, there's even a point in that process where it's like, I would do anything. They're stuck in like, I would do anything to get them back. I would do anything to get them back. Oh my God, is there anything that I can do? Like their mind actually just gets so hyper focused on that. But in that sense, you just begin to work with that person in, again, just helping them to understand that there are things that are not within their control. And that's kind of the premise of therapy too. Like we focus on the things that we can control, and there are things that we can't control. And sometimes our natural mind always leans towards finding an explanation. Well, maybe if we had done this, this wouldn't have happened. If I would have forced them to go to the doctor, this wouldn't have happened. If I would have been there. But reality is we don't have full control over life, over people and their choices and their decisions. Life just happens. And it's really getting them to like, hey, this is what we can control now. This is what you were in control of. And then slowly but surely, just I think a lot of it is just allowing them to process that. Yeah. Because that's their own personal processing too. Yeah. They need to kind of get rid of that. I should have been there, or I should have done more. And little by little, it's funny, but it evolves into like, okay.
Acceptance. Yeah. Yeah.
I don't think that there really is no, like Tessi said, there is no order to grief. And like she said, you could be at the very end where you're in acceptance and something can trigger you and you end up right back at the beginning. But I think leaning into it and again, confronting each emotion and working through it. Yeah. And just knowing that, I think for me, I came to, I had to come to an understanding that we have no control. We think that we have all this control, but we have no control. That was the biggest lesson that I learned, I think, is that we don't control anything. We have no control. The only thing that we have control over is how we're going to react to what happens to us. And so I feel like that's where our power truly lies. And for me, I came to a point where I realized there's nothing I could have done, nothing that would have changed the ending. God called him home. He fulfilled the purpose that God intended him to fulfill, and he called him home.
How did you not become bitter towards God? Because I feel like that's where people might find themselves, and it's a valid emotion and place to be, to find yourself on the other side of this pain, and now have the same questions you had, but a different approach, a different answer, where you're like, God, you could have saved this person. God, you could have healed them. God, you could have. And a lot of people grow bitter and angry towards
Yes.
God. How did you not get to that place?
Again, when I asked God, why did you not save him? And when I heard him respond, I did save him. He's with me. I can't even imagine how my heart, there was no bitterness. There was no, in that moment, it's like the anger, the confusion, the resentment, all of the bad was removed, and it was replaced with almost like a peace that surpasses all understanding, because knowing what I believe in, that as a believer, one day when I leave this earth, I'm going to live the rest of my life in eternity. And if I know that, then that's where my peace lies. It's a change in perspective, right? For me, it was a change in perspective. It was believing what I believe in, right? And having that faith and knowing, if this is what I believe in, then this is where my son is. And the promise that I will see him again, and that he's in eternity, and that he's living his best life. And he's living a better life in heaven than we are here, and I just think, like, thinking those things, how can I have any place in my heart for bitterness?
I want to ask you now a little bit about forgiveness, but before that, I want to ask Tessi, what are some practical ways that people who might be watching right now and are going through grief, what are some practical ways that can help them navigate those emotions and those feelings?
So I definitely think that one of the main things is get connected with community. Yes. You need people by your side. And a lot of times grief wants to isolate you. You want to sort of almost feel isolated in your grief. You kind of want to curl up into a little ball and like hug it like this, like a little pillow, and like not let it go. And you don't want people to maybe see you that way. You want to just kind of figure, I'm going to get through this on my own. No one's going to understand. But being in that community is going to be the best thing you can do for yourself. One, because you're going to have people that are going to encourage you to do things when mentally and physically you're not able to. And another thing too, one of the brain hacks is, we know that there's certain chemicals that the brain releases that helps us feel better, right? So oxytocin, right, which we call the love hormone, guess what? When we're around people and people are hugging us, or we're petting our furry pet, or, somebody's holding our hand and rubbing our shoulder, that's releasing oxytocin. So without you realizing it, you're not doing anything but just putting yourself in a place where people are surrounding you. And so community is like everybody does the work for you almost when you're not capable to do it yourself.
Absolutely.
That's beautiful.
Another thing I would say is what Jackie hinted on a couple times. It's the worst thing you can do is try to avoid feeling the emotion.
Yeah.
So you need to talk to somebody about it. You need to just acknowledge what you're feeling, because if you don't and you suppress it, you create anxious feelings. So suppressing things increases anxiety. Anxiety then continues to alter your nervous system, because it's all connected to the body. So state of shock, or you start to just, work so hard and escaping this feeling that now your anxiety is increasing. And so you're not feeling better. You're actually worsening it. So talk to somebody. And if you can't get to a therapist, right, that's why community is important. Move your body, exercise.
Yes.
Do something to move your body, because that's another brain hack. It'll release endorphins. And you know what endorphins are referred to as? The painkillers. Literally. The way God designed our bodies is phenomenal to me. He has placed chemicals in our brain called painkillers. We work out and they're released. And guess what? They help us to feel better. When we cry, it releases endorphins. So it's necessary to cry. Get a good cry. Get in your shower. Cry. Cry on your friend's shoulder. Find that support. Find a connect group, a community group, anything that you can, because that's another way that you can, again, sort of like create that brain hack and fuse it together with something that's going to help you feel better.
Yes.
Yeah, I love this. I'm always amazed, and I love
I agree.
therapy. And to me, it was really weird when I first became a Christian to see a group of people in Christianity who were so against it and could
Yes. Oh my
not
gosh.
reconcile how your spirituality also plays a part with your physical body.
Yes.
And to me, it's almost pushing aside the creation that God so perfectly created those things. It's like how God did it for a reason, and it's so beautiful that we can see both work together in such a perfect way. Like God gave us a physical body that responds physically
Yes.
to help
He
us with our
equipped
emotions.
our bodies to do all these things. And not to like geek out, one more thing. But you know what you're talking about, the spirituality, worshiping, prayer.
Yes.
That releases serotonin, which is the mood stabilizer. So the greatest way to stabilize your mood is to get in the presence of God, to pray, to worship, to put yourself in his presence.
I was
right?
talking to someone, and sometimes you may not feel like you want to worship. You may not have it in you at that moment to raise your hand because you are going through your feelings and they're valid. But just by placing yourself in that space, by exposing yourself to, even at church, we say it all the time, you may not have that faith in you, but by seeing people around you, by seeing the person next to you, it just does something to you that begins to do something on the inside of you that encourages you, that helps you. And it's a beautiful thing to see.
Yeah, it's
that.
really cool. It's just the way, just God is
Yeah.
amazing.
Yes.
Jackie, now,
Absolutely.
I mean, it didn't happen so long ago, but today, how has this changed you? How has your life changed in the sense of Jackie before this and Jackie now? Beyond the pain is, I'm thinking, how God has used this story. So how are you able now to navigate the feeling and the emotion that's still very much real and you're always going to carry, but also living your life today and allowing God to use this?
So I read a long time ago that you're going to grieve forever because you love forever. And one of the things that through my journey or my healing process, one of the things that I did was this led me to make the decision to lead a grief and loss support group of my own. And so on Monday nights out of my home, I meet with women who have lost spouses, children, parents, family members. And like Tess said, it's very important to be in community. And I remember when this first happened, I remember reaching out to church looking for if there was a grief and loss support group, and I was told that there wasn't. And so that kind of, I remember as time went on, people would make that comment to me, oh, one day you're going to take what has happened to you and you're so strong. You get those comments, you're so strong. You're going to use this for good. You can help other women. And I remember, when you're in shock and you're going through it, you're just like, you don't want to hear any of that. Like, really, honestly, the best thing you can do when you don't know what to say is just, I'm sorry for your loss and I'm praying for you, is honestly.
That's a great point, because
Yes.
oftentimes people mean
Don't-
well,
yes.
but in trying to do the right thing, you just it's just I'm someone that in a
Yes.
situation like that, I don't have the words, so I almost don't want to say something that, because you want to receive.
But there's so many who
Yeah.
are not that way.
Yeah.
And so they don't say the right things.
Yeah.
And there are so many times that the right things were not said. And I always say, if there's any advice I could give to someone who's like, I don't know what to say, what do I do? I always say the best thing you can do is just give your condolences and let them know that you're praying for them. And just show up. When I tell you, there were days that I opened up my door and there were groceries there, meals delivered to my house. People just showed up. They didn't even ask. They just helped however they could. But going back to the loss support group, I remember people would make that comment, and I just remember thinking like, I could never do that. I'm not qualified. What would I say? What would I do? And one thing that I did learn throughout this process is that God doesn't call the qualified. He qualifies the called. And I remember one day, it was last summer, April of last year, Easter service, actually, I came out and I had that revelation of, it's time. It's time to start your own support group, your connect group, and it's going to be grief and loss support. And I was like, oh my God, okay, let's do this. And so it is honestly I wish I would have done it sooner. Let's just say that. I didn't know what I was diving into, but I'm so glad that I did, because I have been able to meet with women week after week after week, and just being able to be in community and be able to navigate the healing process together and just go through all of the emotions, because like we've been saying, grief is so multifaceted and there's so many emotions, and just to meet each week and just unpack that one emotion at a time, and just be able to talk about it, and how everyone, we're all grieving differently, because also grief is not the same for everyone, and that it's okay. It's okay that you're grieving this way. It's okay that you're grieving this way. We're all going to grieve differently. And we're also going to remember our loved ones in a different way as well. So what may work for one person may not work for another. And it's okay, but it's good to be able to come together and share without judgment in a safe space, knowing that everything that's shared is confidential, but just to be able to share and cry and to be able to pray together has been so healing. It really has.
Well, and I think that the important thing about those groups too is that those that are grieving are getting the validation that they need. Because I think we chatted about this a little bit before we started, but there's a lack of validation in the grieving community, because everybody seems to think that you should be somewhere in your process that you're not yet. And then they'll start worrying, or then they'll say something like, pero mira, or sorry, Spanglish, well, look, but look, it's already been a year, it's already been 2 years now, you're going to have to get it together. Like, let's go, so I think that
you can't rush the grieving process.
Yeah.
It's different for everyone. I think, but it is important that you are intentional and that you do lean in and confront it. That I do share. Yeah. And that people, there's two paths to this. When you lose a loved one, and both paths are hard. There's the path of healing, and then there's the other path. But that other path that you take leads to depression and just really a feeling inside of that you can't get you fall into a place where you can't really pull yourself out of.
I like that you say that, because they're both difficult, but one leads you to a place of healing and stability
and being able to move forward. That's the other thing I wanted to touch on, is that people tend to think like, when are you going to move on from this? Like, when are you going to get it together? Like, and it's you don't. You don't move on. You move forward.
And I think the healing part, and this is just kind of like a way to, like, if you don't, the intentionality, when you said intentional, I think that you have to be intentional, because every time you're not, I don't want to say trying to heal, but if you're not trying to work towards that healing, you're really not allowing yourself to be emotionally available for everybody else in your life. And, even Cultivate, like women, right? Women grieve, and they still have to be mothers. Yeah. And sometimes they have to be wives, and they have to nurture, right? Because we're nurturers. Yes. How can you nurture another human being, if you're so emotionally checked out? Because you're so like just immersed in this dark space of grief. So it's leaning in, but at the same time, knowing that it's important to slowly be moving in a direction of an upward trajectory. Correct. Right? Not linear, but then so you can be emotionally healthy for others. Correct. Which I think, You're an amazing mom.
Thank you.
You know, to your other two babies who
Yeah.
are really good friends with my two babies.
Yes.
And so I really commend you for that.
Thank you.
So
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that's important too, as well, especially when you have other children. And another thing that I remember thinking about is, obviously I have two other children, and thinking I want to be there for them. You know, yes, this loss has impacted me, but it has also impacted them as well.
I was going to say that
in
it's not just you
different-
grieving and being a mom, is that
It's-
you're grieving. You're trying to be
yes.
their mom and help them walk through their own grieving process.
And we all grieve so differently. And
especially
so-
children and
yeah.
teenagers, they don't
Children-
grieve the same.
No, and we all process different based on your age. And so navigating, it's just so complex, because Ethan at the time was 10. And so it impacted him very greatly. He was very close to Justin, whereas Bella was 6, and she was very young, and she was more like very faith-like, oh, my brother is in heaven, and you know, it's like he's still here, but he's there. She was just very childlike faith, and processed it that way. But Ethan processed it a different way, and I was processing it a different way. And I just remember that first week, I had a friend come and visit me, and she had, years ago, she lost her brother and father within days of each other. And she told me that, she goes, Jackie, if there was anything that she wanted to share with me, she said, you know, my mom was never able to overcome the loss of my brother and my father. When she lost my brother, my father, was almost as though like we lost our mom too, because she was never able to, she was never the same.
Wow.
She was, and it was very hard for her, because she was like, we're still here. And I remember that resonated, that sank with me. So that was within the first week. And I remember that sank within me so deep. And I remember thinking, I don't want to be that mom.
Yeah.
I don't want to be that mom where I'm so inundated in grief over the loss of my son. And because I'm not coping.
Yeah, that they would
or
almost have to
healing,
grieve their mom too.
that my children would have to grieve the loss of their mom as well.
Yeah.
They're already grieving the loss of their brother. I don't want them to grieve the loss of their mom either. And I remember that also put this fire in me to also want to be the best that I could be for them, because they were still here, because I was still their mom, and I still had a role to play in their life, and I needed to be able to heal so that I can help them as well navigate the healing process, so that we could be healthy together, you know, and so that they wouldn't feel like they lost me as well. I never wanted them to feel that they were not as important, because I loved all of my children.
Absolutely.
You know?
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. Thank you, Tessi, for being here. Yeah. We are running out of time. There's so much more we can talk about. There's a whole nother part on forgiveness that maybe we'll do a part 2 and we can talk about that. But before we close, just really, really quickly, briefly, what would you tell someone who's currently navigating through grief? What would your encouragement be to that woman that's watching right now and they're trying to navigate this season?
I would tell them there's hope. You're not alone. And there is hope for the hurting. Surround yourself with community. That is going to be my biggest recommendation. Find a grievance counselor, someone that you can speak to, a grief and loss support group. Lean into your church family if you are connected to your church. Definitely go to church. Reach out to your mentors, but surround yourself with people that are going to pour into you, that are going to pray for you, that are going to just be able to be there for you when you're having a moment. But don't go about this by yourself, because you don't have to. there's so many resources,
Yeah.
and you don't have to do it alone. That would be my biggest recommendation.
Tessie, from your mental health perspective, how can you, or what would you tell someone who's currently feeling like they are losing this grieving battle? They're stuck. What would be some practical ways that you can help them to perhaps move on from the place they're at right now?
So if someone is stuck, they need some form of an intervention. So try something that you haven't tried before. Again, I'm an advocate for therapy. I think it's important to have a professional sit with you, educate you on grief. I think a lot of people don't understand what's happening. Mm-hmm. They don't understand what stage they're in. They don't understand that what they're feeling is normal. So get with a professional, get with a therapist if you can. If not, community, find a group, people. Again, yes. You need to increase that love hormone. You need to fill yourself with that. And then I would say you have to just trust the process and know that there's a light at the end of the tunnel. That's really important. You just got to dig your heels in and say, hey, healing is my ultimate goal. I need them to start, right, focusing on that, like it can happen, and to just dig their heels in and keep on chugging along until they get there.
I do have one more thing to add.
Yes.
Do the things that bring you joy. Definitely do the things that bring you joy. A lot of times when you've lost a loved one, you feel guilty when you do things that make you happy because you feel like they're not here. How can I be happy? They're not here. I should be sad. But do the things that bring you joy, like you were saying. All of those things are good for you. They're part of healing. They're part of coping. And your loved ones would want you to, they would want to see you happy. They would want to see you moving on. They are happy. They are in a better place. And so definitely do the things that bring you joy. It definitely helps with the healing process as well. It makes a difference.
Yeah. Thank you, guys. Thank you so much. Thank you, Jackie, for sharing your story. Thank you, I know, and you, Tess, for bringing your knowledge. I know this is helping so many people, and we'll talk about this some more. I know that there's a lot more that we can talk about. Yes. And so if you're watching, thank you for watching. We hope that this has helped you, that it has encouraged you, that it has given you tools that perhaps you've been needing. And we will put some resources as well that you can, tap into and maybe learn more. I just thought about this when I was, we were talking right now. If you are into therapy, if you're into the mind, and you are a believer, there's someone I love, Dr. Anita Phillips. She is absolutely incredible, and she has a just incredible way to bring both, our beliefs and also how our mind works. So you can look her up, and Dr. Anita Phillips, she's incredible. And if you have a prayer request, if you are going through this and you need to find that support group, perhaps where you're at, maybe if you're in the Miami area or wherever you are, we would love to help you. Leave us a comment, DM us, let us know, and we would love to help you in any way that we can. We'll be praying for you. Thank you for joining us for this conversation, and we'll see you next time.